Hello, and a warm welcome to all of you joining us today for this webinar on strategic foresight for cultural heritage, which is organised as part of the ICCROM lecture series. Before we begin, just a few words about ICCROM for those of you who don't yet know us. We're an intergovernmental organisation working in the service of 137 member states across the world to promote the conservation of all forms of cultural heritage for all people. Also, just a quick housekeeping note, we've set aside time at the end for a Q&A session. So please send us your questions via the chat box that you see at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we really look forward to hearing from you. Today, we will be talking about foresight, what it is and what it could bring for cultural heritage. In particular, we'll also be sharing with you about a global horizon scan study that we undertook as part of ICCROM's new Foresight Initiative. And today I'm very happy as we're joined by 5 fantastic speakers who work in very different areas, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce them to you now. So I'd like just all our speakers, if you could turn your videos on. We're joined by Amy Iwasaki, who is an emerging heritage professional and has supported ICCROM's Foresight studies as an intern and as a consultant. She holds a BA in geography from the University of California, Los Angeles, and has spent the past 4 years working for the Getty Conservation Institute on the abstracting database AATA Online and also the Mosaic-on Initiative for Mosaic Conservation. We are also joined by Dr. Toki Lerton-Brown, who works as a heritage architect and cultural economist with emerging ecologists. She is an associate member of the International Network of Traditional Building Architecture and Urbanism, a voting member of the International Scientific Committee on Cultural Landscapes, and a focal point on ICCROM's SDGs working group. She holds a joint PhD in economics and techniques in the conservation of architectural and environmental heritage from the University of Nova Gorica and the Università IUAV di Venezia in Italy. We're also joined by Dr. Adela Leeson, who is head of socioeconomic analysis and evaluation at Historic England, where she leads its social and economic research and the production of Heritage Counts, which is an annual audit of the historic environment. She is a member of the DCMS Culture and Heritage Capital Steering and Working Groups, and prior to joining Historic England, Adela worked as an associate economic consultant for 10 years, advising public and private clients on economic development and regeneration programs. She previously worked in academia, also as a research at the London School of Economics. We also have Stefan Murkowski, who is a conservation scientist. He worked at the Canadian Conservation Institute for 40 years, retiring just 2 years ago. He developed advice for preventive conservation and risk management of collections, and in his own words, much of his focus was on deconstructing the false assumptions behind traditional climate control advice for museums and in advancing evidence-based and sustainable specifications. Finally, we're also joined by Dr. Gustav Wollens, who holds a PhD in archaeology from Kiel University and is currently working as a project leader and researcher at the Nordic Center of Heritage Learning and Creativity in Östersund, Sweden. He has a large research experience in critical heritage studies with a particular focus on heritage futures, difficult heritage, and contemporary archaeology. Now, all 5 of our speakers contributed to the Horizon Scan study that we will be discussing in a bit, but I really would like to stress that this was a large collaborative effort. And so I'd like to start by saying a very big thank you to all of our SCAN team. Our 5 speakers will be sharing their thoughts on strategic foresight and cultural heritage and also the Horizon Scanning project, each from a very different perspective. So I would like first to turn to Gustav, if everybody can switch this video off, and we'll just start with Gustav, who works in the area of foresight studies, to start us off by telling us a bit more about foresight. So Gustav, what is foresight and why do we need it?
Thank you very much, Alison, for that very nice introduction, and also for inviting me to contribute to this webinar and also to this exciting initiative. I'm going to now share my screen with all of you. And I hope you can all, I hope that you can, wait a minute, I need to, I hope you can all see it. I need to just make it full screen. So thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. I will now talk a bit about strategic foresight, what it is, what it can do, and also why I think that the heritage sector would benefit to work more with strategic foresight. So foresight is a systematic and structured way of engaging proactively with the future based on a set of tools, skills, and approaches. Foresight will create alternatives for the future, expand the range of opportunities and options, and make futures actionable. It locates the future more in the present rather than in the distance, making us ask the question, how can we identify the necessary steps and actions now to make transformative change? Successful foresight exercises will challenge mindsets to think in new and creative ways. It will force us to think outside the box when it comes to the future, and maybe think about the future in ways we have never thought about it before. It will reveal core assumptions about how the future is anticipated. Sometimes the assumptions we have concerning the future can be very common sense and seldom put under scrutiny, and it can be useful to actually put them under scrutiny, and foresight will help in that process. It will increase resilience and adaptability in the face of a changing world, and it will also stimulate participants to be proactive rather than reactive. And what I mean by this is that it will stimulate participants to act on inducing or making change rather than only reacting to changes happening in a rushing present. One important distinction that I think is important to keep in mind is that the foresight is not the same as forecast. And I think that many of you are also familiar with forecasting, and it is sometimes also used within the heritage sector. It tends to use models such as economic models or climate models or demographic models to predict a likely future, often through quantitative means by extrapolating trends into the future. And I do think that forecasting is important and it can serve a very useful function. It has also been argued, it has been criticized that it sometimes risks projecting contemporary values and ideas onto future generations, that it's sometimes lacking in a critical perspective. Foresight, on the other hand, is non-predictive, and the success of a foresight exercise is not based on the accuracy of predictions, but on the constant diversification of imagined futures. And this was also expressed by the researchers in anticipation, Riel Miller, Roberto Poli, and Pierre Rossell, when they wrote that the evaluation of anticipatory activity is not related to plan fulfillment or the accuracy of predictions in divining outcomes. Instead, success is based on the constant diversification of imagined futures, including non-predictive and non-normative descriptions of tomorrow, with the outcome being the expansion of sensing and sense-making in the present. The most common way of engaging in foresight is to build scenarios, different scenarios for the future. And I think that in such a process, I think it is important to keep certain things in mind. And one of them is to also include so-called wild cards. And these are futures with low probability but high impact, futures that may not seem very likely today, but if they occur, they will be potential game changers. And including these ones increase resilience in the face of the unknown or the highly unpredictable, and they make us better prepared for the unexpected. I also think it is important to keep in mind emerging futures based on the fact that futures are constantly emerging in the present, and that foresight can be a tool to capture these novel futures, meaning futures that may even be previously unimagined because they are only just starting to be visible. And in order to capture these ones, we need to be attuned to these weak signals that are just about possible to distinguish these weak signals that may become stronger in the future. It's also important to keep in mind that diverse teams will create more diverse futures. So to be conscious about the kind of the team or the who is participating in a foresight process, and we need to anticipate heterogeneous futures rather than homogeneous futures, because the future is going to be or will be very diverse. And the foresight process should therefore be participatory and open. It should be a safe space to express multiple perspectives and ideas. And another thing to keep in mind is that anticipation is ongoing. It is not episodic, and it does not have an end date. Preferable futures will change over time, which will continuously demand adaptation and the implementation of new actions and strategies. It should be implemented within long-term strategies at an organization so that it is carried out, that Foresight is carried out on an ongoing basis, and that there's a structure for that. It is not enough to just do one Foresight exercise and then be happy with the results and work on them, but it has to be ongoing, an ongoing process of Foresight. So why do we need it within the heritage sector? The heritage sector is motivated by an expressed and explicit responsibility towards future generations. Most famously in the 1972 World Heritage Convention, it is framed as a duty to protect, conserve, present, and transmit cultural and natural heritage to future generations. But who are these future generations which we are protecting, conserving, presenting, and transmitting cultural and natural heritage to? I've been involved in previous research projects and also current ones together with colleagues where we have examined future perspectives and future awareness within the heritage sector. And we have found that at large, the sector is lacking in an informed awareness about future change, and also lacking an awareness about what kind of tools and methods there are to engage proactively with the future, often working towards future generations that are more or less similar to the present ones. But what we know for certain is that future generations will value and do heritage in very different ways than today. Consequently, that the very concept of what heritage is or should be will be different. In some, change is unavoidable, and it is not in itself a problem in need of being resolved. And this makes Foresight an urgent concern within the heritage sector in order to be also better equipped at dealing and addressing some of the major urgent concerns that we face in society concerning, for example, climate change, wars and conflicts, and political extremism. And there are tools and methods of engaging proactively with the future out there, and they are available for us to use. And within this initiative at ICCROM, we were working with horizon scanning as a method. And now Amy will present more specifically how we engaged with horizon scanning and what that method means. Thank you very much, all of you, for listening to my presentation. And I leave over to, I guess, Alison at first.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Gustav. So from what you have saying, in a sense, Foresight, it's really about challenging our assumptions about what we think about the future. It's not about predicting, it's about challenging assumptions and thinking about the future differently, and also multiple different futures that could come, in order that we can start to see maybe where we need to be acting now. So it's really about the present as well. Okay, I would now like to turn to Amy, who's been helping us, working with us very closely on Foresight Initiative and the Horizon Scanning project in particular. And by the way, did a great job helping us with analysing all the data that came out of this. Amy, could you tell us a bit more about the Horizon Scan project, what it aimed to do and how it was set up? Thank you, Amy.
Sure, so I'm going to just share my screen a little bit. Okay, so thank you, Alison. It's been really great to be involved with this project, and I'm really happy to be here presenting today. So now that Gustav has given a little bit of a primer on what Foresight actually is, I'll be sharing the methodology of ICCROM's Horizon Scan study. For this study, we trialed a Foresight technique, horizon scanning, to gather intelligence from heritage experts around the world about changes that might impact cultural heritage in the next 15 years. This study actually marks the first structured effort at ICCROM to gather intelligence about the future of our sector across many different domains. So here I'll begin by covering how we approach the actual horizon scan exercise with the production of scan reports and potential future trends. And this then culminated in a workshop with the Horizon Scan team to unpack the main takeaways from the exercise. And finally, I'll give a brief overview of the method of qualitative data analysis that was undertaken to report on the results of this study. So first, a little bit about horizon scanning itself. Horizon scanning is an established foresight technique for gathering intelligence about the future by surveying the environment in which an organization or a sector lies. What differentiates horizon scanning from the informal environmental scanning that we often do in our day-to-day work is that it systematically searches beyond a sector's internal environment. It instead emphasizes the macro trends that might have an impact on a more targeted area. And it also aims to detect weak signals of change in the horizon. Think as an example of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we already know has deeply impacted the heritage sector. This is an event that few, if any, in our sector saw coming, but we now know that public health experts had been raising warnings about a pandemic for several years. Effectively, the idea is that there are these little bits of knowledge that are contained within different fields, and this horizon scan exercise works to consolidate these scattered bits of intelligence. Horizon scanning is often guided by the PESTLE framework for situational analysis, which looks at political, economic, societal, technological, legal, and environmental forces in the external environment. So now on to ICCROM's study. Our Horizon Scan study began last fall by assembling an international team of 17 researchers who collectively represented diverse fields of expertise from heritage science to cultural economics. Working with the consultants, a list of topics was generated on potential future trends that might affect cultural heritage. And these topics spanned all PESTLE categories to ensure a breadth of scope. This map I've put up here illustrates some of the areas that we covered in our scan reports. For example, changing age distributions, climate change impacts, digitization, and decolonization. The consultants were tasked with conducting research and writing scan reports roughly a page in length responding to this question: what emerging issues might affect cultural heritage, heritage conservation, and ICCROM in the year 2036? On the left here is an example of a submitted report. First, the consultants describe the trend in question, then the broader implications of the trend across various sectors, and finally, its implications specifically for cultural heritage and its conservation. In writing these reports, the scanners were really challenged to think outside of the box, as thinking creatively about the longer-term future isn't really a muscle that we exercise often in our day-to-day work. In the end, the team produced a total of 62 scan reports, and the submitted reports were collated and shared with the participants for their individual review. The scanners were asked to rate each scan along 5 criteria, namely novelty, likelihood, significance, timescale, and distribution of the trend. Ultimately, we did find that our scale and our criteria are required for the development, but this stage did serve to ensure that the scanners read through all the scan reports and thought critically about the topics to prepare for an engaging group discussion. Now that brings me to the workshop part of the study. On the 23rd and 26th of November of last year, we held 2 3-hour workshop sessions over Zoom with the scanners to unpack the main takeaways of the scan reports. This workshop aimed to ground the findings of the scan reports into more practical intelligence and actionable recommendations for ICCROM strategic planning. On the first day, participants shared their overall reflections from the scans and collectively identified priority themes in the future of cultural heritage. Then on day 2, participants used the findings of day 1 to identify key opportunities and challenges moving forward for cultural heritage, and then develop some preliminary recommendations for ICCROM and the broader heritage sector. So now at this stage, we found ourselves with 2 very rich sources of foresight knowledge, namely the scan reports and the workshop transcripts, which required further analysis to draw out main takeaways. For this, we used a method of qualitative data analysis called coding. In a nutshell, coding involves labeling coherent portions of text within a document with various codes or thematic categories. As these codes are generated, these categorized groupings of text can be reorganized and restructured to mine key themes within the data. Coding is a useful tool in that it allows researchers to systematically sort and structure large amounts of textual data. It can also increase the validity of the analysis through continuous interaction with the data, minimize analytical bias, and ensure the transparency of the research. For our transcripts and scan reports, the coding was guided by a STEEP framework, which we condensed from PESTLE. And then under each STEEP category, subcodes were iteratively generated for key emerging themes. And the results of this analysis are now being used to generate a report to ICCROM Council to inform the next strategic directions. So that's been our methodology up to this point. Just to conclude, I just want to mention that this is the first time that most of us have organized or participated in a horizon scan or even a foresight exercise. So it's truly been a learning process every step of the way, I think, for all of us. And there are little bits of the methodology that we might tweak if we were to replicate this study. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Amy. I think everybody can get a feeling for just the sheer amount of work that went into this study. And as I said at the beginning, it was a huge collaborative effort. So really thank you to all those researchers who contributed their time and their scans to this effort. I'd now like to turn to our other speakers. So we've heard a bit about foresight and also how we set up the Horizon Scan study. But really, I think the next thing that we want to look at now is really what came out of all that. And so here now I'm going to turn to our remaining speakers, Toki, Stefan, and Adala, to tell us a bit more about findings from the study. To make it easier, we'll keep to the structure that we used for the study that Amy mentioned, but not necessarily in strictly that order, the PESTLE structure. So I'd first like to turn to Toki. I'd like to start with you. Toki, what for you were some of the main themes arising from the political and societal scans in particular? Was there anything that came out that might challenge our assumptions or make us think differently about the future? Over to you, Toki.
Hello, everyone. I just want to say that I'm one of those that this was the first time for me doing this type of research, so it was quite interesting. And what came out of it is the politicization of heritage, which we all know is unavoidable. And so issues like rights-based approaches, the colonial practices that challenge Eurocentric perceptions and perspectives, narratives also was at the core of this. And as we look at heritage, which can be a painful reminder of injustices committed, which in turn creates a pushback against historic and systemic oppression. So during this scanning processes, issues like increased inequality of marginalized and oppressed people's rights was prevalent throughout when I was doing the scans, and access to culture and heritage was a big thing. Again, politicization of heritage, so seeing loads of nationalist agendas, identifying policies of minority groups were all core, from the scans. And then this whole idea of Eurocentricity, diminishing itself within universal ideas was also what was coming up. So I also saw a decrease in multilateralism, diminished engagement with state parties within international organizations, and also the marginalization of cultural heritage from future sustainable development frameworks, the UN Agenda 2030. My reflections from this experience, regarding decolonization, racial injustices, nostalgia, changing professional actors meant that within this framework of decolonization, we'll see a lot of activism, the implications of colonial methods of collecting, conserving, interpreting, cultural heritage. And I wonder if decolonization also means that we don't need to have museums in places like Africa that have their artifacts in ancestral shrines, and that the collecting, conserving, and interpretation is entirely something else in places like Africa. Racial injustice of Indigenous people and Black communities, cancel culture groups, restitutions, reparations, all of that will be coming forward now as we go into the future, I guess. And then again, nostalgia, whose nostalgia are we conserving? So changing professional actors and then working more on capacity building and seeing that we have different faces at the table, bringing in different ideas will be more of what will be happening. And that is what I took from the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Toki. So it looks like, you know, a lot of change, a lot of increasing multipolarity there, a lot more multivocal, maybe though a not more equal world, perhaps. It seems to be where we're going.
More inequality, because I think the more a lot of groups focus on what their needs are locally, the more globalization becomes something of an audience to local needs. And so from all of that, I feel that there's a shift. There will be a shift. So a Eurocentric shift to more of indigenous peoples, you know, coming out with their own ideas, more of minority groups talking, becoming vocal. And it, of course, is a double sword as well, right? So with activism, you see a lot of the negatives of that backlash and that pushback. So we will be seeing a lot of inequalities, you know, based on whose perception now from this geopolitical shift.
Yeah, and in your view, the future of multilateralism?
Okay. It is perception, right? So whose nostalgia, whose multilateralism are we talking about? Who's being more vocal, right? So I guess the more groups that are vocal, the more of that we'll see from that perspective.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Toki. I'm now going to turn to Stefan. So just if we can bring Stefan, could you walk us through the environmental and technological scams? And again, what for you were the main messages in there? And what perhaps are we not thinking enough about right now that we really ought to? Over to you, Stefan.
Thank you, Alison. There were 4 key ideas that were uncovered by the team working behind the scenes for each of the two topics I'm covering, technology and environment. So 8 points. So what I've done, rather than answer the questions formally, Alison, is I'm going to tell a story about a museum director who was born yesterday. So let's visit him 40 years from now. They arrive at work and approach the door. The face recognition system sees them, and the museum's synthetic building intelligence system speaks. "Good morning, director. How are you today?" The director replies, "Cut the formalities, Hal. Any progress on solving the cyber attack on our born digital collections yet?" "No, director. You did not upgrade my security systems to quantum coding 13.0, so I'm afraid we will have to pay the ransom or watch the collection disappear." The director sighs. "Hal, you know very well what our budget is. How are we supposed to keep you up to date? The Microsoft Amazon Shell mega corporation is the only source of good encryption software. The well-meaning open source nerds at Wikipedia and GitHub are years behind, or else working for the criminals. See if you can negotiate the price down with the hackers. I sure wish my parents' generation fought harder during the digital monopoly wars." Okay, moving on, Hal. How's the Children's Gallery doing? Did they hack the portal we share with the ICOM Children's Galleries Committee? It's the biggest subcommittee in ICOM now. I love how kids can share multiplayer history enactments across the world using instantaneous translation. Are the portals okay? Yes, director. The hackers left those alone. I don't understand. The director sighed again. Sometimes your intelligence is truly limited, Hal. They left those terminals alone because those terminals are free gifts from the Microsoft Amazon Shell Corporation. and the criminals don't dare confront the security people of the mega corporations. But, says Hal, isn't it wonderful that the terminals are free?
He's telling a story.
They're not free, Hal. Haven't you looked at the history stories in those virtual reality terminals? They're full of corporate product placement. I hate that. I hate not having full control of the message of our values. That reminds me, make sure to prepare the background files I need for the meeting with the ICCROM committee on Our Values Matter Too, and that other committee, ICCROM, what's it called? Oh yeah, Culture Cannot Wait and Wait and Wait. And for Facebook's sake, keep them away from the corporate netbots. Hal interrupted. Why is Facebook a swear word, Director? Long story, Hal. My mother still misses Facebook, but well, my generation, we just lost interest or we lost patience. The director stopped his walk down the hallway to look through the bulletproof glass at the reserve collections. Well, at least I don't have to worry about the old stuff, the real stuff. Hal sniffs. True, Director. I have been maintaining a low-risk environment at net zero carbon for 2 decades now. In fact, I estimate that with our wind turbines and all the windstorms this year, we may even make a profit in electricity. But why do you insist on calling those old things the real stuff? I'm very real too, as were my digital files before they were stolen. Don't remind me, says Director. Director? Yes, Hal. Can we discuss the new exhibit? My facial recognition systems tell me that the visitors all leave very depressed. They should be, says Director. My exhibit explains the history of how we ended up with half the planet uninhabitable due to impossible heat and crazy weather. You know, Hal, there's a reason we survived here in Siberia. Our colleagues in the United States of the Arctic, that is Alaska, Nunavut, Finland, Russia, and Siberia, we all have the best warm climate now, well, except for the tornadoes. New York, London, Paris, Shanghai are all just versions of the old Venice, except with alligators. And the original Venice is, well, you can take the glass-bottom boat tours if you want. Most people just sign on to virtual tours with the drone cameras. So Hal, what my exhibit is trying to do is help people understand that we failed to understand that heritage was a big concept, a planet-sized concept called Gaia. Our human heritage is just a subset of Gaia's heritage because we are a subset of Gaia. The old heritage experts thought collecting bits of nature in natural history museums was the answer. They forgot to save nature as a whole, well, at least the nature that was really nice to us, our old Goldilocks nature. It's still nature, just a nature more like the angry mother and father bears. Nature doesn't like us much today. The Director paused. Hal waited a discreet moment. I do love when you tell your stories, Director. I wish they were more jolly. The Director sighed again. They could have been if we had taken the science seriously. Museums, archives, we never had hard power. No more than a gentle person with a cabinet of curiosity had hard power 3 centuries ago. But I often wonder if we missed a chance 40 years ago to nudge people towards the right attitudes. Who knows what could have been if we had just nudged them a bit, set a better example in our own carbon footprint, or for Facebook's sake, actually been proactive in our exhibits and outreach programs. Who knows what might have been? And fade to black. That's my story, Alison.
Thank you, Stefan. I love that. Thank you so much for taking us on that future odyssey and connecting really the now to the future and the bigger picture, and really about recognizing the value of what we have. Huh?
Mm.
Thank you. Okay, so now we are going to move, finally, our final speaker is Adala. Adala, you're going to take us in a very different direction. So can you walk us through what stood out for you within the economic sphere? And again, what do you think we should be thinking more about? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Alison. I think I've taken this actually from the wonderful group at ICCROM who kind of summarized our economic discussion in 3 key areas, which are about looking through the lens of economics, what are we valuing and how do we value? So this approach, essentially, we had lots of discussions and looking into the future about working within our current economic models and this growing need to broaden our understanding of value, including how we demonstrate and articulate the value of heritage. And I'll discuss this a little bit more in a minute. We also looked at diversifying some of our existing models, particularly our business models through business model innovation, which is about creating value and capturing value, but again, looking at a much broader assessment of what is value and who is valuing. Similarly, innovative finance is a much needed approach within the cultural heritage sectors to impact the future sustainability. There is a lot going on here in other sectors and not in our sector. So that was something we also very briefly discussed and looked at. And then the final element we looked at within this economics is something I'm going to talk about. Obviously, these are quite big issues, so we're only going to focus on a few right now, is this idea that we need a paradigm shift, a step change in the evolution of our economic models. So I'll particularly look at the first and the latter. So I think where we started, or what I always say, is economics is a really powerful tool. Whether you like it or not, you are involved in this crazy system of economics. And it started a long, long time ago with Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, looking at the invisible hand, saying we will always hit equilibrium in a free market where supply and demand are in equilibrium and there is no need for government intervention or other interventions. And as we go through time, I've just kind of picked this up this from somewhere. And I think it's a really interesting way of looking at how things have evolved, leading us to where we are today, which is what many people would classify as a neoliberal model to economics. And I guess the main point and the reason we need to really think about this evolution of economics is a lot of the names that you'll see on here, and there are many others that aren't on here, are essentially the advisors of to our kind of evolving societies, our evolving political economy, our evolving business and commercialization of various different assets. And this idea of how we use economics, it is really important and used almost on a daily basis in certain circles to make decisions, to make big decisions that impact you, me, and everyone else. And this ethos that is the kind of ideology that is driving your economics has a really big impact on the actions that are taken. But one of the things that is emerging, and we are looking, foresight-wise, obviously we're forecasting into the future, is there are two key areas that I'll look at, but there are lots of others, is the inequalities and environment. So in terms of inequalities, what we're seeing is particularly, and there is a correlation, I think it's in this trend compared to the one I said, where we're in, since the 1980s, we're in this neoliberal model, where you're seeing this kind of growing income inequality, but also wealth inequality, spatial inequalities. I mean, I just looked very briefly before we had this meeting, and one of the drivers of what we do, what our governments do, is increasing income, increasing GDP. That's something you'll hear, GDP growth. And GDP has grown. It's grown tremendously. I looked at some statistics. Since the 1960s, we've seen a 6,000% in global GDP growth. Of course, population has also grown, but we're looking at something more like 260%. So we are in this train of growth, of constant growth, and it is what we're aiming for. But what we're also seeing, and what a lot of commentators and economists are seeing, is this growth in inequality. And one of the focuses of the future is how do we address this, either within our current models or with that paradigm shift. Similarly, we have the same with carbon dioxide emissions. I mean, there are lots of different ways of cutting the data, but it's really the trend that we're looking at here is this upward growth in carbon emissions, and the real impact it's having on our day-to-day lives today. And it's this, is this approach, is this economy, this economic growth approach sustainable? And this is where a lot of economists and other commentators are looking at, is this the right model? And what does the future hold? We know we need to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions, but actually when you look at this graph of the trend, there are very few times we have seen a decline, and those times that we have seen a decline, it's been due to an external, very negative factor. So economics is a powerful tool, but at best it is an incomplete and evolving science. And it's this thing that we need to be aware of in kind of thinking forward is, you know, what is our future? What does our future hold? And there are lots of kind of people theorizing in this area, you know, particularly around the environment. There are ecological economists that call for a step change and a change in the status quo. Degrowth is also something that is discussed in that debate. We have donut economics, we have circular economics. These are sort of terms that people are using, but they're essentially about addressing that issue around environment. And then on the inequality side, we're seeing a growth in the idea of well-being as a driver of economics. So well-being economics, we're also seeing evolutionary economics, feminist economics. All these things may shift our trajectory, but I think the main thing to be aware of is we are part of this economic system, but it is evolving and there is room for change, and there is room for the heritage sector to contribute to that change. And I think, Alison, you're here because you need me to stop talking, but I will just very quickly show you something we're working on, which is working within the current system, which is what we call a culture and heritage capital approach, which is really trying to pick up on the multiple values that heritage provides and including these within our economic system. So I am going to stop there because I think I've run out of time.
Thank you so much, Adela. And really, I didn't want you to rush, actually. It was so good, really interesting. And really just in a way, I think in some ways it's quite depressing looking at those graphs, but in other ways it's very powerful. I think what you're just saying is that we're part of this. It doesn't have to be like this. And maybe things like cultural heritage that are a common good and you can't put a price on, but contribute to well-being, can be part of driving that change.
We must be, yes, we must join the conversation. We can't sit by passively.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adela. Right, now, so we've heard a bit about some of the main things, the big ideas that are coming out through all these horizon scans. But before we get to the Q&A section, I'm noticing there's been lots of comments going in the chat. Before we get to the Q&A, I'd just like to ask all of our speakers to come back and share just a few reflections on what was the value of the exercise for them. So if you'll come back and you can switch your mics on and just jump in, I'd just like to put the question to you. So what was the value of doing this exercise, and also Foresight in general for you? Who'd like to go first? Shall I start? Who's going to jump in?
I will go.
Okay, great, Toby.
For me, it was quite an eye-opener. Like, you hear of things, you know, you feel like you're not part of the discussion, but you hear of things that are happening, and then you see things happen. But this sort of brought everything to the forefront that, okay, this is why this is happening. This is the genesis of why this is going towards this trajectory. And so for me, that was quite enlightening, because we actually see these trends, even though we're going further into the future, but we see bits and pieces of it just, showing itself in different aspects, and then you're like, oh, wow, so this has been going on, really? And, and so when you start to look more into it, then you say, oh my God, this is, okay, so this is how it started, right? It's the whole idea of decolonization, right? Everyone keeps talking decolonization, decolonization, decolonization. And for me, from where I'm coming from, decolonization means what exactly, right? We're decolonizing from Western, methodologies and stuff, but then we have capacity building and we're still using the same methodologies. So I'm thinking, all right, decolonization means what again? And it's difficult. I'm going back to the whole idea of museums, right? This whole idea that we're having capacity building with museum officials in Africa when artifacts were not in museums. But it's called decolonization.
Yeah, good point, Toki.
I'm just like, okay. Yeah, so that would be me.
Who else would like to jump in next? Or do I just pick?
Maybe I can. So the value for me, well, it definitely opened up, for me personally, it definitely made me think about the future in different ways than I thought before. It opened up new futures for me. Some of them were quite bleak and some of them were more optimistic, and some were in between. Some futures could be either or. And it also, and in such a way, I think it also opened up perspectives on how to act now. I think that's something it did. But it was also interesting. So that's kind of more on an individual level. I think it was also interesting that after doing all these scans, then we did these 2 workshops. And I think that's this kind of work that when we met over Zoom and actually started to discussing each other's futures. I mean, we started to kind of connect different futures in a way, in a collaborative way. And I think that's something that really sparked something new as well. And I think that's something that to bring with us when doing Foresight. I think that it's working collaboratively with futures when the real magic happens, I think, and interesting kind of collisions and connections between futures. Concerning I think the most challenging part was the assumptions. We have a lot of common sense assumptions concerning the future, and it's really difficult to kind of deconstruct them. I think for me, that's the most challenging part in general. And also one final thing is that I think in terms of the societal scans, I think it showcased the future and present importance for heritage sector to be facilitators, like opening up, like the importance in also providing a space for change to happen, where we also sometimes might need to maybe not be the ones that always initiate the change, but make change possible through facilitating, also for listening and maybe taking a step back and listening and taking in perspectives. And also, as Toki said, including those marginalized voices or actors that are not very vocal, also include them in the process when opening up a space for change to happen. That's some of my reflections. Of course, there's so much other thoughts and ideas to contribute with, but just some short ones.
Thank you, Gustav. Yeah, it really does kind of open the head, and it is that sharing and the idea this is constant, ongoing process. Who next would like to jump in?
I'm happy to jump in. I think at one point I was going, this is a really mean exercise, because we were asked to write about some really big issue. I mean, first it's finding. So you said go out, look for kind of trends, even it might be a small thing that you think could go that way. And that is a needle in a haystack approach. So I think I kind of got myself into a very downward spiral for a while, just reviewing and reviewing, but it did give me that opportunity to actually go out and read things and not just do kind of what I know I'm always doing. So I would definitely recommend it to everyone to do that. But the key thing, I think, with this foresight exercise, we have done foresight and do foresight within our Historic England as an organisation in terms of developing our strategies and thinking forward. But we tend to do it quite differently. This was asking us to then go away and summarize in a maximum of 1 or 2 pages, which was the biggest challenge. But do you know what? It makes you have to think much, much harder and translate what can be something very technical and difficult into something much more intuitive and understandable. Is that, hang on, is this the economy that we want to live with, and is this the economy we want to grow, and how what are who's out there thinking differently, and that I just found was really a good opportunity to read things that are a bit more left field, maybe not so academic or policy based and international for me, because I tend to work very nationally. So I would recommend to others to kind of, you know, obviously the findings from this, and it was just really wonderful speaking to all your different speakers, because you brought us together in a workshop, and you know, I tend to work very much UK based, so it was just nice having that expanded view. But I would recommend to everyone to also take the approach that was used, even if it's, you know, in a much smaller context, and it's very helpful to kind of visualize where you want to go and therefore steer you and your future. So well done, ICCROM.
Thank you, Adela. I'm sorry we were so mean. Now, who's going to go next?
I'll step in here.
Go on.
Mean. It was hard work. It's structured. A lot of us over the years in institutional positions, you do planning exercises, envisioning exercises, and little yellow stickies and things. For me, the biggest difference here, aside from the structure, is simply the amount of time commitment and the staging over many weeks, so that it was a break away from this delusion that you can do deep thinking in an 8-hour workday and wrap it up for report by Friday. So this was a nice change from that into what's more of a intellectual exercise, which recognizes nothing really deep is going to come up unless you spend quite a bit of time and headbanging on it. The other thing that struck me was that it reflected a kind of zeitgeist of the time, because the notion that there are many futures, the multiverse from physics, the movies, the latest mega movie is Doctor Strange and the multiverse of madness. We were essentially asked to look at all of the different possible universes into the future. And I think that can be partly depressing. Certainly, we'll probably discuss this a little bit more, but one does look at the dark side of humanity, and there's lots of evidence for that right now. And on the other hand, the reason you do that, as novelists and poets will tell you, is so that you can choose not to passively go through that route. But I think pervading our conclusions in all of the topics is that if we as a group, as a community, as humans are passive in the face of what seems to be inexorable, huge forces, then the future will be relatively dark. And the other idea that really we're trying to uncover, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, I think, by Amy and Gustav, is that this is about finding resilience. I'm very much influenced by David Orrell's various books. He's a mathematician, kind of a futurologist, but he warns against trying to do predictive models. And he ends up in the end saying, models work sometimes, but the most important thing we can do is to build resilience. And resilience is anticipation of many futures and trying to get us to go in the direction of a better one, recognizing what the pitfalls would be if we don't.
Thanks, Stefan. Yeah, certainly it is. I felt, certainly from a lot of the comments coming back from the SCAN team was like, you know, well, why are you asking us to do this? It's really difficult. And I think it really challenged also a lot of people. Like, we're trained to do research in a certain way, we're trained to work in a certain way. And this was really, I think, quite difficult to just kind of abandon some of that and really move into the left field, as Adela called it. And yet at the same time still really come, you know, it has to be rigorous and to come back with those yeah, real nuggets of evidence. Amy, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Sure, I'll throw in a word just from the back end of helping to organize this study. I think that, yeah, like Stefan, you said, it's really about building resilience and building these skills in how you approach everything that in your work. So I think that this introduction of Foresight really did shift the way that I approach cultural heritage. I think not just in our sector, but in society at large is so used to being reactive versus proactive to the changes and trends that are happening all around us. So yeah, as a young heritage professional, I obviously have a very large stake in the future of cultural heritage. So it's been really interesting. And I think something everyone has said is eye-opening is one of the key words here.
Thanks, Amy. We've just, yeah, and exactly that. I think eye-opening was and brain-opening was you know, a very commonly felt reaction. We've had some questions coming in. We don't have a lot of time left, I'm afraid, but I'd just like to put just a few of these questions to our speaker. And so I'd just like starting off with you, Gustav. For other institutions that might actually want to start doing Foresight, where for you is a good place to start?
Oh yeah, thank you. I think that the fact that the institution is actually asking this question is a very good first step. I mean that the organization is actually, I want to work more actively, proactively with the future. It's a good first step because based on some of the interviews I've done, sometimes actually during the conversation, the person I speak to comes to the realization that, yeah, we actually need to work more with the future. I haven't really thought much about it because I'm stuck in an everyday actions and activities. So that the first step, you know, comes that we need to work more with the future. And after that, I think that the next step would be to get familiar with the kind of what Foresight is and how we are working, how we want to use it. I mean, there's the UK government, there's a toolkit that the UK government has that is useful. I mean, maybe we can include some information about where to find these resources. There's also an American Alliance of Museums has a report that is part of their Trends Watch called Navigating a Disruptive Future, which has a chapter on Foresight. And there's a lot of research on it. So the methods and tools are there. So the next step would be to kind of gain an understanding. And maybe ICCROM can play a role here as well, actually, to kind of organize workshops and increase knowledge and awareness about how to work with Foresight. That could be very useful to lower the threshold to get to that step. That it's not that difficult necessarily. You can do it. It's not impossible. And then, I mean, embed Foresight within the board of the organization in processes and strategies so that it becomes long-term, you know, included in the visions and goals of the organization. Establish a team with the responsibility to work on it. So if it's everyone's responsibility, then it becomes no one's. So establish who will be working on it, and then start doing Foresight exercises, and be careful with, you know, making the process participative and inclusive. Maybe also include participants from outside of the heritage sector. So because sometimes we need someone external to see certain processes that we who are internal may not be able to see. and then start doing it. You might not succeed perfectly the first time, but allow for some mistakes to happen and do better next time. Don't be too afraid of engaging with foresight. It's very much possible to start now.
Thanks, Gustav. So it doesn't matter if it's messy, but from what I'm getting from you is one of the main things is the more perspectives you involve, the more futures you will see, in a sense. Amy, over to you. You made a comment about, like, you know, some things you might change. If you were to design the study again, what would you change?
Sure. So I mentioned in my presentation that the review criteria that we gave to the scanners when they were looking over the collated scan reports, those are something that we might rework in the future if we were to replicate this study, because they didn't quite capture what is, you know, high priority for a horizon scan. For example, likelihood was one of the criteria, and actually for a horizon scan, although the highly likely scans and trends are very important, they typically point to trends that are already known about, like climate change. So we want to find more of those outliers, for example. Another one, as Gustav said, there's the possibility of bringing in researchers outside of the heritage sector that could bring in an interesting perspective. And then finally, so many of the scans were quite creative, but some of them were more safe, for lack of a better word, because this is the first time that all of us were partaking in a horizon scan study. So it's a fine line trying to guide our researchers to be more creative and open-minded about future trends, but also we don't want to guide them too much in a specific direction, because that will also limit creativity. So that would be something that would be interesting to rework as well.
Thank you. Yes, and then I really, that resonates with me a lot, actually, that fine line. And also, since we were all learning, you know, what this is and how to do it, sometimes it felt a bit like blind leading the blind. And yeah, I think the more you do it, hopefully the better you get. Next, we have a question actually for Toki. Toki, you talked, you know, there was a lot about globalization. What about deglobalization? How do the Foresight scans account for trends in deglobalization?
I think I'm going to take Stefan's stance in this one now. The multiverse. So deglobalization from different perspectives in the multiverse, right? So from different regions, what their perspective is of deglobalization, from their own ideas of what that will mean for them, for their own day-to-day activities, and how that affects them, still using the global audience, right? So we see that with all the TikToks, and we see that with all the Instagram stuff that people are doing now, which it's all about self-care. It's all about their day-to-day activities, so local needs. So they're deglobalizing that aspect, but they're still using globalization when it comes to audiences. So the platforms are still global. So yes, we'll see more of that, and we'll see a lot of decentralization of a lot of stuff when it comes to organizations and self-organizational activities. And so I think for me, the wild cards will probably be the ones that will throw people off, you know, as we go along with all these activities that we're doing.
Yeah, that's really thought-provoking. Thank you, Toki. Right. Okay, I've got a question here for Stefan. Stefan, through your humorous Black Mirror take on the environmental and technological scans, could you also expand more on what you feel are the main messages of hope?
Okay, well, the general principle, I am a cup half full kind of guy. So the fact that there are dark and light futures that all of the different sectors in this exercise uncovered is, for me, hopeful, because it means we do have a choice. And there are glorious utopian futures. It probably won't be fully Jetsons and flying cars and museums that float in the clouds. There are always futures which carry forward a lot of what's today. We don't know what exactly is going to change, but I come back to the hope is in is mindfulness, awareness of what the alternatives are, and then finding the ways to be effective politically or socially or economically. So I didn't want to start, bringing in too much politics and neoliberalism issues and capitalism and so on. But I think everyone realizes if you read the papers and think a little bit, those are issues. But that's all embedded in this larger human enterprise of I forget whether it was a great novel or some kitschy movie, which ended up with hope is the only thing that is going to help us. So I'm hopeful because there is such a thing as hope, and it has worked for humanity in the past. I think from time to time, those of us who are writing these reports or scanning the literature, in a way, you'd go like, oh, there's another dark path. There's another dark path. I'm going to actually today, I'm going to try and find one of the brighter ones and see if it's credible without being just a utopian fantasy. And I think on the technology side, it was almost all about computers and whether those were going to be ultimately good or bad. And, you have to avoid going into a Terminator mentality and think of all the great things that one does with a smartphone and project that into the future. So I'm fundamentally hopeful, but I recognize that's fundamentally an irrational stance, but it's our best hope.
Thank you. So hope is an outstanding universal human quality, let's say, and it's that will get us through, and also recognizing what's happening. And from what I'm hearing from you is also seeing where you need to connect and work with other sectors to try and
I realize in my head, you can't just leave it at hope, because that just becomes passive and someone else will do it. And I will be hopeful about what everyone else is going to do to help this. You have to engage and you have to be active if you want to change the path towards the future.
So be active with hope.
Yeah, but you're not going to be active if you lose hope. And that's been clear from all the different climate change activists and so on. The universal message, aside from the fact that dumping science on non-believers doesn't work, you have to change their attitude. So we have to find better ways to change attitudes. And there's a ton of research coming out on how to do that.
Thanks, Stefan. I have one final question now, which is for Adala. Adala, a politician once famously said, "You can't eat culture." What is your reply to them in view of the future or futures we might be facing?
I think I don't know if it's an important question, but I'll answer it this way. Cost of living, we're facing a cost of living crisis, so we cannot diminish the fact that there are people out there struggling to feed families, to feed children. I think what I would say is our economic choices have in part led to some of the situations we find ourselves in. I think it's really important to kind of go back to some of those graphs I was showing, and the idea that actually we have seen wealth increasing. We do have enough wealth on this planet to feed everybody, but it is how is that wealth distributed? And that is where we are making very specific choices based on ideologies, political decisions, etc. And this is where sort of I'm saying that economic evidence also has a really big role to play. It's not entirely economics, I'm not saying that, but it has a role to play. And then it goes back to, you know, what are we valuing? Well-being is really important. Are we moving away from this idea that that accumulation of wealth is the end goal towards an accumulation of well-being, belonging, inclusion? And I think that is really the answer I would give to that question is, you know, not everybody is struggling to feed their families, even though there is a growing amount of people, and there is still world poverty, world hunger is a real issue. The idea that we move from wealth to well-being, things like mental health today have a real impact. They have a real important place in our economies. If you are not mentally well, you won't go to work, you won't earn your income, you won't be able to ultimately potentially feed your family. So I think it's really important that we go back to, you know, what are our values? And really in this case, it's about distribution. And what we argue is that actually cultural heritage is really, really important to people's well-being. It's important to make us feel centered, to make us feel a sense of belonging. It gives us a sense of identity. It gives us a community. It gives us recreation activities. There are so many different dimensions to what our cultural heritage can provide in the context of well-being. So yes, it is not something we eat, but it is something that is necessary for us to live well.
Thank you, Adela, for putting that so beautifully. And I'd also just like to say a lot of people there's been a lot of questions in the chat about how we'll be sharing all this work. So I'd just like to flag that the results of this study will be published. They will be published soon. So please do keep an eye out on the ICCROM website and social media. But as I said, the full results will be coming out as soon as they are ready. But it's been a lot of work to wrap up, so but it's coming. Anyway, I think on that point, I'd like to conclude this webinar since we're already a few minutes over. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank all of our speakers who've been so generous with their time today and their insights, and just really brilliant. Thank you very much, all of you. But I'd also like to give a shout out to our organising team here at ICCROM, who really have been working hard. You can't see them, but they're working hard behind the scenes to bring these webinars to you. And I'd also like to thank you, all of you who've joined us today, for your interest and for your questions. And also just to let you know that the recording of this webinar will soon be made available on the ICCROM website, where you can also find previous webinars from this lecture series, and also you can find it on ICCROM's YouTube channel. You can also find information about our future webinars if you do a search for ICCROM lecture series. And of course, don't forget to check out our social media platforms. The next webinar actually will be one on reorg, which will take place in Spanish, and it's going to be on the 9th of June. So that's it. Thank you very much for being with us. I hope you'll join us again soon. And in the meantime, regardless of what tomorrow might bring, go well, and please take care of yourselves, each other, and heritage. Goodbye.